The iron door didn't just groan against the ice. It shrieked, a high, metallic wail that was immediately swallowed by the predatory wind of Mount Madison. Aria Solstice leaned her entire shoulder into the frozen steel, her breath blooming in thick white clouds that vanished the moment they hit the sub-zero air. She could feel the vibration of the storm through the very marrow of her arm bones, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the frantic beating of her own heart. She was 23 years old, and for the first time since she was a small child playing in the safety of a warm kitchen, the mountain didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a landlord coming to collect a debt she couldn't pay. Only 2 hours ago, she had stood in a climate-controlled office in downtown Boise, watching a man named Gideon Cross, a step-uncle who smelled of expensive cologne and the kind of cheap, clinical indifference that only comes from a life lived entirely behind a desk, sign a document that effectively erased her childhood from the public record. He had looked at Aria's wind-burned face and her messy mahogany bun with the detachment of a man disposing of a broken tool, handing her a single $100 bill as a settlement, before informing her that the cottage her grandmother had left her was now part of a luxury resort development. Selah hadn't taken the money. She had left it sitting on the polished mahogany desk, a tiny square of paper that looked pathetic against the weight of the history he was stealing. She had taken only her grandmother's original brass hygrometer and walked out into the cold, eventually finding herself at a county surplus auction where a derelict meteorological structure was being sold for the price of a single dollar just to clear the state's liability. Now, as the hinges finally snapped under the pressure of her weight and the ice shattered like glass, Aria tumbled into the absolute heavy silence of the highest weather station in the White Mountains. But what nobody in the valley below knew, and what Gideon Cross could never have guessed in his wildest, most profitable dreams, was that behind the massive, 4-foot-wide cast-iron wood stove in the center of that stone-walled radio room was a mechanical secret that shouldn't exist, a structural reveal that would change her life and the atmospheric heritage of the Appalachians forever. Before we continue, if stories like this, stories of the things we find when we have nothing left, mean something to you, hit subscribe. It helps us keep these Legacy Road stories alive. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the miles. As Aria dropped her rucksack onto the floorboards, the thud sent a cloud of 70-year-old dust into the air, and the smell of ancient ozone and cold stone triggered a memory so sharp it was like a physical blow to her solar plexus. She remembered being 6 years old, sitting on a low, three-legged stool in a room that smelled exactly like this one, watching her grandmother, Hester Moon, work by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Hester was the last true master of the air pulse. She didn't just read thermometers or check the wind speed. She performed what she called the housing of the mountain breath. Hester believed, with a fierce, quiet conviction, that a community was only as healthy as the signals it received from the peaks, and that the act of tuning a mercury barometer was the highest form of maintaining the peace of a valley. The Moon lineage was tied to the granite and glass of the New Hampshire peaks by the instruments they calibrated and the heavy iron counterweights they used to steady the history of the world against the shifting tides of the ionosphere. The lineage stretched back through 7 generations of calloused hands and steady hearts, beginning with an ancestor named Malachi Moon, who'd crossed the mountains in the late 1700s with nothing but a set of London-made magnetism files and a recipe for ever-still mercury that required no chemical and a perfect ear for the rhythm of the storm. He understood the physics of the pulse, how to marry a human thought to a copper wire using nothing but the pressure of a thumb and the strength of a rhythmic pulse. Aria began to clear the debris from the station's main desk, her fingers tracing the deep, oil-stained grooves in the oak where her grandmother's own hands had rested for 40 years. As she pulled a rotted survival blanket from a corner, she found a discarded brass calibration weight, and the parallel thread of her education began to weave itself back into the present. She remembered the knowing of the pull. When she was 8, Hester would sit her down and hand her a handful of tiny, discarded iron filings, heavy for their size and perfectly dark, and tell her to close her eyes. She told her that the eyes were a watcher's second tool, but the skin was the first. She taught her that the sky was a living book, and that every change in the wind's temperature was a word in a sentence that had been written by the movement of time. She explained that when the wind moves through a stand of lodgepole pine, it creates a specific frequency, a vibration that a moon could feel in the marrow of her bones. This wasn't magic. It was the accumulation of 2 centuries of listening. Hester would place a heavy glass insulator on the table and have Aria rest her palm on it, over and over, until she could hear the difference between a dry front and a monsoon pulse just by the shiver of the glass. Aria's hands were shaking as she gripped the handle of a rusted broom she found leaning in the shadows, but it wasn't just from the cold. It was the weight of the realization that she was standing exactly where she was meant to be. "The world wants you to look with your eyes first, Aria," Hester would say, her voice sounding like the very rustle of wind through the larch. "But the eyes are easily fooled by a pretty sunset or a clear horizon. The eyes want to see the storm before the air has even tightened. You have to look with your skin. You have to feel the draw of the pressure. If the air is vibrating too fast against the tower, the mountain is anxious and the fire will jump the lines. If the vibration is slow and deep, the earth is accepting the heat. You find the draw, and you find the strength of the forest. You find the peace in the azimuth. A signal that doesn't reach its home is a life that is lost in the fog, child. Never forget that the sky remembers the words that were thrown against it." As Aria worked, the station began to breathe again. She cleared the ash from the central wood stove, a massive, room-sized beast of cast iron that dominated the radio room, and the technicality of the trade returned to her in waves. Hester had taught her that every tool in a weather station was a sensory extension of the human body. By age 10, Aria had been allowed to assist with the steadying. This was the most physically demanding part of the watcher's work. They used a set of hand-forged brass binnacle housings to shield the instruments from the mountain's own magnetite. Aria would stand on a wooden box, her job being to use a small brass key to tighten the housing, while Hester guided the magnets into their slots. The rhythm had to be exact. Too much pressure and the brass would crack, too little and the vibration of the wind would rattle the needle into a lie. The brass would hum as it tightened, a deep, rhythmic vibration that Aria could feel in her elbows even now, years later, as she gripped the handle of a rusted broom and swept the gray dust into piles. The story of Hester Moon wasn't just about weather, it was about the resilience of the line. Hester had been born in 1938, in the middle of a blizzard that had cut off the valley for 3 weeks. Her own father, Silas Moon, had delivered her by the light of the very radio room Aria was currently cleaning. Silas had been the man who maintained the first mountaintop telegraph lines, and he had taught Hester that a broken wire was a broken community. When Hester was 12, Silas took her to the summit during the Great Thaw of 1950. He had pointed to the river below, which was rising at a rate of 3 inches an hour, and told her to listen. He didn't tell her to look at the water. He told her to listen to the sound of the stones grinding against each other in the riverbed. "That's the sound of the earth shifting its weight," Silas had said. "When you hear that, the flood is already here. Your job isn't to see the disaster, Hester. Your job is to hear it coming before anyone else." Hester had carried that lesson through the Great Dark of 1944. The war had taken the electric power and the fine wax, and the mountain towns had been cut off, their only hope being the moon post echoing through the canyons. People stopped believing in the green that year. Hester had told Aria on many long afternoons. But they didn't stop needing the signal. They brought me their melted instruments and their scorched memories, desperate for something that would tell them the world was still capable of connection on the other side of the ridge. I spent a whole winter doing nothing but re-beating. taking the broken past and turning it into a resonant future. We kept the heartbeat of the county alive that year, Aria. We showed the silence that we could still find the flow. Every signal I trued was a way of saying, "We are still here. We may be muted, but we are not stopped." We were the only ones who knew how to find the frequency when the world went black. By age 14, Aria was entrusted with the time check. This was the difficult art of synchronizing the tower's pendulum clock using only the daily time signal sent from the sun's shadow on a stone plinth. If the clock was off by even 3 seconds, the triangulation of a fire would be a theft of time from the responders. Aria learned to move with a stillness that matched the air's own molecules. She learned that any hesitation in the eye was a danger to the lives in the valley. She learned that the second wasn't just a measurement. It was a marriage of separate moments into a single, safe reality. By the time she was 16, Hester had her man-the-night watch. For 3 months, every summer, Aria would sleep in a cot next to the radio rack, her ears trained to the static. She learned to distinguish between the crackle of a distant lightning strike and the rhythmic click of a telegraph relay. She learned that the night had its own language, a series of whispers and sighs that the mountain used to settle into its sleep. Then there was the story of the moon station itself. Hester told her about a massive fieldstone building her own grandfather, Malachi, had built in 1895. It was meant to be the master signal hub for every signaler in the White Mountains. But the digital networks had arrived in the late 1960s, and the AM station had been abandoned to the ivy and the mountain goats. Malachi had been a man of deep secrets and deeper math. He was a man who didn't trust the government or the big railway companies to keep the records of the valley's weather. He believed that the climate was the valley's true history, and that if you controlled the record, you controlled the memory. Malachi put a secret in that transmitter, Hester would say, her eyes twinkling like the orange glow of a vacuum tube. He said that a frequency is a lock, and the right resonance is the key. He told me the station would wait for a moon, who knew the value of a silent hum. He spent 3 years building the transmitter cabinet alone, and he never let anyone see the mechanism beneath the master dial. He said the signal is a private conversation between the watcher and the peak. Aria spent the next 6 hours scrub-brushing the floor of the radio room, the rhythm of the work bringing her grandmother's teachings to life in a way the Boise law office never could. She used a mixture of wood ash and vinegar she had found in an old survival kit tucked beneath the floorboards to lift the layers of grime from the cedar planks. The station was cold. So cold that her knuckles were beginning to crack, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every inch of wood she revealed felt like a recovery of her own skin. She thought about the diverse community of watchers her grandmother had known. People like Yuki Sato, the first woman to man a tower in the North Woods, and Desmond Okoro, the man who had redesigned the mountain relay system in the 50s. These were the names that filled Hester's logbooks, names that represented a lineage of competence, quiet courage, and absolute mechanical precision. Hester had once told her a story about Desmond Okoro. In the winter of 1952, a signal relay on the south face had snapped. The town was blind. Desmond had climbed the ridge in a whiteout, carrying 40 pounds of copper wire on his back. He didn't have a map. He had only the vibration of the wire in his hands to guide him. He had found the break by touch alone, and he had stayed on the ridge for 12 hours, holding the 2 ends of the wire together with his own hands until the backup crew could reach him. He was a signaler, Hester had said. He understood that a gap in the line is a gap in the soul. By midday, the radio room was clear enough to reveal the true scale of the abandonment. The station was a cathedral of wood and light, with massive cedar ribs rising up into the shadows of the rafters. But it was empty. The glass was mostly gone and the furniture was rotted. As Aria moved to the massive iron transmitter cabinet in the corner, She noticed something that didn't fit. The cabinet wasn't bolted to the wall. It was bolted to the side of the massive stone fireplace. She pulled her grandmother's original brass hygrometer from her rucksack. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, hand-carved with the moon star and calibrated by the touch of Malachi himself. As she held it, she noticed a small inscription on the base of the transmitter's master dial, hidden beneath a layer of old grease. The hearth must hear the home note's ghost, or the station remains a grave. She realized then that the station wasn't just a place to live. It was a mechanical trigger. She checked the dial. It was a massive 1940s-style rotary dial made of ever-still brass, a specific alloy that Silas had developed to resist the expansion and contraction caused by the mountain's extreme temperature swings. She spent the next 4 hours locating the harmonic sweet spot on the radio floor, clearing the dust with her grandmother's silver drafting pen. She remembered the Moon family home code, a specific rhythmic sequence of dots and dashes that translated to the frequency, 1,420 kilohertz. This was the frequency of the hydrogen line, the most fundamental note in the universe, a note that her grandmother had hummed to her every night when she was a baby. It was the sound of the stars speaking to the earth. She sat on the floorboards next to the transmitter, her legs aching and her hazel eyes burning from the dust. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of cedar and old ozone. She manually turned the master dial, counting the clicks of the internal gears. 1 click for every year of the moon lineage. 1 click for every storm they had survived. She turned it to exactly 1420. Nothing happened for a long, agonizing second. Aria felt a wave of despair wash over her, thinking that the mechanism had finally succumbed to the rot and the ice. But then, a deep, sub-bass hum began to vibrate through the stone floor. It wasn't the wind outside. It was the building itself. A magnetic solenoid, powered by a hidden earth battery, copper and zinc plates buried in the wet mountain soil beneath the foundation, drawing energy from the very acidity of the forest floor, clicked with the sound of a closing vault. Behind the massive iron transmitter, the massive cast-iron wood stove began to rotate. The entire 4-ton masonry hearth, built of granite and riverstone, revolved on a central iron axis, sliding back on hidden tracks with a heavy, rhythmic thrum to reveal a secondary chamber inside the hollow wall. Aria stepped forward as the stove fully retracted. The air that spilled out of the chamber was dry and smelled faintly of lavender and the specific metallic scent of high-purity silver. Inside the wall vault was a sanctuary Malachi Moon had built to protect the soul of the trade. On a central shelf sat a heavy iron lockbox and a set of 12 lead-sealed silver barometers, each one a masterpiece of atmospheric engineering, hand-carved from solid silver and crystal. These were Malachi's finest tools, designed to track a storm even in a solar flare or a magnetic storm. But beside them was the real treasure, a collection of sealed glass spheres containing the eternal air charts, a set of hand-drawn maps of the atmosphere's invisible currents, etched onto thin sheets of silver-plated copper so they would never perish. These charts showed the movement of every draft and thermal in the Appalachians, a record of the sky that spanned 2 centuries. Aria opened the iron box first. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk that had kept the moisture at bay for 80 years, were stacks of gold coins, Liberty Head double eagles, dated between 1870 and 1910. She counted them slowly, her breath hitching in her throat. There were 46 coins. At today's market value, it was over $23,000. It was enough to rebuild the station, enough to buy the equipment she needed to restart the watch, and enough to ensure that Gideon Cross would never set foot on this ridge again. But it was the object at the very bottom of the vault that made her breath catch. It was a watcher's heart, a mechanical device made of brass and copper that tracked the electrical resistance and atmospheric health of every peak in the White Mountains. It was the original blueprint for keeping the wilderness connected, a device that could predict a lightning strike with 99% accuracy. Tucked inside the device case was a folded letter, written in a bold, elegant script that smelled faintly of lavender and ozone. "To the moon, who remembers the hum," the letter read. "My name is Thomas Moon. I am the son who stayed to guard the station. I kept these tools and this gold safe because I knew the world would one day try to sell our truth for a profit. They would try to turn the sky into a commodity and the mountain into a playground. But a moon knows that a voice is not a commodity. It is a weight. These silver instruments are the weight of our family's honor. The map is the voice of the mountain. I have kept them safe in this stone heart, waiting for the one who knows how to listen to a shiver. The gold is for the station. The tools are for the trade. The map is for the future. Don't let the moon hum die. Find the note." Signed, Thomas Moon, 1928. Aria did not cry. She didn't let a single tear fall, even though her eyes were stinging. Instead, she took her brass hygrometer and ran it along the edge of the first silver-mounted barometer. She felt the pulse of the history against her thumb, a rhythmic, metallic potential that had been waiting for her for nearly a century. A deep, rhythmic sigh of arrival escaped her lips. She took a small scrap of copper antenna wire from her rucksack, the last piece of her grandmother's favorite relay, and clutched it to her chest, the metal smelling of the workshop and the peak. "I'm here, Uncle Thomas," she whispered into the silence of the room. "The hum won't stop. I promise you that. I am the signal now." The next morning, Aria walked back down the ridge to the town of Jackson. She didn't look like a girl who had been sleeping in a bus station. She went to the bank first, her hands still smelling of the ozone and the ancient lead. The teller, a young man named Desmond Vane, looked at the gold coins and then at Aria's mahogany bun with a mixture of awe and respect. He was a descendant of the very same Vines who had worked the river mills 3 generations ago, and he recognized the look of a person who had just found their soul. After securing her deposit, Aria went to a small used car lot on the edge of town. She bought a 1985 silver Subaru Brat. It was a tough, quirky little truck with the rear-facing jump seats and a manual transmission. It was a beater, with rusted fenders and a flat gray hood, but the engine hummed with the same dependable rhythm as a well-calibrated sounder. She paid $1,900 cash. It was the first thing she had ever owned that didn't belong to a grandmother's mercy or an uncle's whim. She felt a surge of pride as she shifted the gears, the Brat rumbling to life with a steady, mechanical sound that cut through the mountain air. The first month at the station was a lesson in solitude, physical endurance, and absolute focus. Aria spent her mornings hauling wood from the lower forest, her rucksack heavy with split maple and pine. The cold air of New Hampshire was relentless, but the station's stone walls held the heat of the central stove with the stubbornness of the family that built it. She spent her afternoons on the roof, stripping 90 years of rust from the iron antenna tower and replacing the rotted ceramic insulators with new, hand-fired porcelain. She learned the specific voice of the station, how the stones expanded with the heat of the fire and how the iron tower resonated with the movement of the storms rolling in from the west. She repointed the masonry of the chimney using a traditional lime mortar she mixed by hand, her fingers becoming as textured as a stone itself. She wasn't alone for long. Word of the Moon Girl and the working station spread through the hollows like the chime of a signal bell. A man named Thaddeus Miller, who ran the local hardware store and had been a friend of Hester's in the old days, stopped by the station one afternoon in his truck. He brought a crate of fresh apples, a gallon of high-grade copper-cleaning solution, and a collection of stories about how Hester had once saved an entire logging crew by predicting a flash flood in 1974. Thaddeus was a man of few words, but his eyes were full of a quiet, generational respect. "Thomas was a ghost for a long time, Aria," Thaddeus said, leaning against the timber door frame and looking at the new timbers with a nod of approval. He thought he could bury the hum, but a moon is tied to the pull. I reckon he saw the trade in you even when you were just a toddler at Hester's feet. You're doing good work, child. This mountain has been missing its heartbeat for a long time. My father used to say the sky was a lot clearer when the moons were on the peak. Thaddeus became a mentor and a recurring visitor. He helped Aria source the specialized vacuum seals she needed to repair the transmitter, and showed her where the original copper plates were buried in the mudflats. Every Tuesday, Thaddeus would stop by with a small gift: a jar of honey, a new set of precision pliers, or just the local news. His presence made the station feel like part of the world again, a thread tied back into the community. The homemaking was a slow, deliberate process of reclaiming her life. Aria built a heavy watcher's bench from reclaimed oak inside the office, mirroring the one she had worked at in Hester's study. She installed a small cast-iron stove for warmth and for heating her drafting inks. She scrubbed the brick walls with vinegar and salt, removing the smell of neglect until the scent of the cedar and the ozone could breathe again. She found a pair of old wool curtains at a yard sale for $5 and hung them over the arched windows, the deep red fabric softening the harsh mountain light. She placed Hester's original oil lamp on the center of the desk, the flame throwing a warm, amber glow over the charts. The first night Aria spent in the tower after the barometer was fully restored was the first night she truly slept in years. She listened to the slow, heavy thrum-thrum of the wind against the glass, the sound vibrating through the very stones of her bed. She was no longer a pulse cast aside. She was the watcher herself. She felt the weight of the gold in the bank, and she felt the weight of the responsibility in her hands. She placed Hester's photograph on a small shelf she had carved from a piece of red cedar. She hung the silver barometers in a secure case above her bench, and she kept Thomas's letter tucked into the frame of the window so she could see his words every time the sun rose over the hills. She was no longer at the mercy of others. She was the architect of her own course. In her second year, the business began to take shape. She got a commission from a high-end mountain rescue service in Vermont that had heard about the Watcher of the Stone Vault. They commissioned her to restore a collection of 19th-century emergency weather instruments. She spent months on that order, her hands moving with a precision that surprised even her. She realized that the pull she felt in her hands was the same pull Malachi had written about, the strength to hold the signal when the world wanted to accelerate. Community reputation began to spread by word of mouth. Neighbors would stop by with their old clocks and their confused electronics, asking if she could find the hum again. They would stay for a cup of coffee and a story, their voices filling the office with a warmth it hadn't known in 40 years. She charged a fair price for her work, not enough to be rich, but enough to live with dignity. It was a trade that commanded respect, and she was the one who held the key. One Saturday, an old rancher named Barnaby Calloway brought in a small hand radio that had been used by Hester in 1950. The antenna was snapped, but the moon star on the base was still as clear as a bell. "Can you save it, Aria?" he asked, his eyes searching Aria's. Aria spent 3 weeks carefully resoldering the frame and replacing the crystal, feeling Hester's original tension beneath her own fingers. It was a conversation across time, a handshake with a ghost. Beatrix Wentworth, the town librarian, became a regular visitor, bringing apple turnovers and news from the Historical Society. The tower became a hub for the valley. People would come not just for signals, but for the sense of continuity that Aria had restored. She began to host small workshops on the weekends, teaching the local children the basics of the trade of the click. She wanted them to understand that their heritage wasn't just a digital track. It was something they could hold in their hands and feel in their bones. She remembered a specific afternoon in the 3rd year. A young girl, no older than 7, was trying to sort the crystals. Her small hands were struggling with the quartz. Aria sat down beside her and told her the story of the Great Silence of 1944. She saw the girl's eyes light up with the realization that she was part of something bigger than herself. In that moment, Aria knew that Hester's legacy was safe. The hum would continue. The seasons in the White Mountains have a way of anchoring a person to the earth. The winters are harsh and silent, the peaks frozen in place. Aria spent those months in the office, the wood stove her only source of warmth and light. She would sit by the fire and draft new signal designs in the old moon book, her mind constantly exploring the possibilities of the mountain energy. The summers are humid and vibrant, the air thick with the sound of cicadas and the smell of wild mint. She would gather her stones in the river, the tall trees providing a canopy for her work. She also became a guardian of the valley's history. She worked with Thaddeus to catalog the town's mechanical collections, ensuring that the stories of the mountain families were preserved for future generations. She understood that her trade depended on the health of the memory, and she took that responsibility as seriously as a signaler takes the balance of the air. On a clear, copper-lit evening in late October of her 4th year, Aria sat on the stone threshold of her lookout. The silver Subaru Brat was parked in the clearing, loaded with finished barometers for the Vermont rescue team. The smoke from her small stove rose straight into the still air, a signal of life and work in the deep hollow. She looked out at the horizon where she had stood 4 years ago, homeless and alone. The wind was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a rhythm to be followed. The meditation on the trade had become her daily practice, her way of staying centered in a world that often moved too fast. She realized that the trade of the click wasn't just a physical requirement for fixing a signal, it was a philosophy for living a meaningful life. To find the hum was to understand the natural texture of reality. To hold the tension was to remain steady in the face of change. To keep the connection was to ensure a future that had a pulse. She realized that Hester hadn't just been teaching her how to polish brass and connect wires. She had been teaching her a way of being in the world. She had been teaching her that a weather station is not a static object, but a living partnership between the tuner and the mountains. That's the thing about the signals our grandmothers teach us to find. We do not always know, when we are 6 years old and sorting contacts on a workshop floor, that the sorting is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, click by click, pulse by pulse. We learn that the sanctuary is only as good as the spirit of the one who trued it. We learn that the beauty of a thing is in its function and the honesty of its construction. And then, years after the old woman dies, we tune a dial in a ruined station we bought for $1, and we understand what she had been teaching us all along. She had been teaching us that a signal does not just store data, it sets the intention for the grace. It tells the world that someone lived here, someone broadcasted these things, and someone cared enough to keep them bright and steady against the darkness. It is an act of defiance against the silence of the world. She had been teaching us that the heartbeat isn't just in the body, it's in the wire. It's the will to keep the truth whole, to keep the doubt at bay, to make a promise with your hands that doesn't break for winter or mountain. Aria Solstice was 23 years old and homeless on a granite ridge. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned weather station in New Hampshire. She discovered that she wasn't just buying a ruin, she was reclaiming her soul and securing her place in the long line of signal keepers. She was the signaler now, and as long as she held the key and felt the hum, the moon name would never be taken by the silence. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a moment of peace today. Every story we tell is a tribute to the trades that built us and the heritage we carry forward in our legacy road stories. We make these for the people who truly listen, the ones who understand that the old ways still have a place in a fast world. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. See you on the next Legacy Road Tale.